Welcome to another edition of Recovery Today on PAC 14. My name is John Winslow. I am your host. I am on the board of directors with the Recovery Resource Center here in Salisbury. I'm also with the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence of Maryland. And I also happen to be a person in long-term recovery, which for me means that I haven't used alcohol or other drugs in over 41 years now. And I have a very special guest today. I have Tom Hill from the National Council for Behavioral Health. He is the Vice President of Addictions and Recovery. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, John. So great to see you. So great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and this is a very special day for me interviewing you because not only are you a friend of mine, you are one of my top-notch recovery heroes, and so thrilled to have you on the show today. And one of the things that we're looking for you to help us with today, Tom, is to take us from the local and regional perspective of what we're doing with recovery-related concerns here locally and move it up and connect the dots with what's happening on a national level. And certainly you, with your expertise and your history and experience, are the person to be able to offer us some insights on that. So
thank you, John. Happy to do that.
Thank you. And so maybe just for starters, if you could let us know how you happened to get into the recovery movement.
So, as we always introduce ourselves, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and what that means for me is that I haven't used alcohol or other drugs for over 25 years. And, in early recovery, I always say in people in early recovery, there's a lot of things you have to unlearn and relearn and sort of become a whole new person in the world. And for me, one of my early recovery tests was coming out, really coming clean about my sexual orientation that I'd been very vague about in the past and actually used substances to be vague about that. Mm-hmm. And so, all of a sudden I was out to the world. I did not have to lie. I didn't have to change pronouns. I didn't have to tell stories about what I had done or not done over the weekend with my coworkers. Everything was changed, and I loved it so much because I felt so free and so liberated for the first time in my life. And I loved coming out so much that I decided to come out twice. Mm-hmm. And I decided that if coming out about my sexual orientation was so liberating, what about coming out about my recovery status?
And how was that for you?
For me, again, it was like I didn't want to tell any lies. I wanted people to know that this exciting new journey I was on and what that looked like, and I didn't want that to be a secret or something that I held under a rock.
We have this concept in recovery that you're as sick as your secrets, and so...
Well, I think for me that was really true, and shedding all those secrets, I didn't want to keep more secrets. And also, practically everybody had seen me in active addiction, so they saw me being a public nuisance. So I thought, why did I want to hide this turnaround of being in recovery for folks to see the positive side? And I think, in retrospect, I certainly wasn't the first person to do that, and I later joined a lot of people who talked about doing that and then doing that, becoming public about their recovery. And not everybody should come out. Many people may have reasons to not come out. We need to honor that. But for people who are thinking about it or want to be out or are out, that's how we teach the public about what recovery looks like.
Tom, you're one of the pioneers in this recovery advocacy and this coming out concept of for folks that are in recovery. When I first met you, you were the director of programs at Faces of Voices of Recovery with Pat Taylor, and there were some very exciting things that were some flames that were really getting ignited through Faces and Voices of Recovery, and then soon after that with the Greg Williams, the Anonymous people, Bill Weitz and all his work, that the flames really caught a full blast and swept swiftly across the country. Can you tell us a little bit about the pioneering?
So in 1998, I was hired by the LGBT Community Center in New York City. They'd gotten this grant from SAMHSA, that Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It was called Recovery Community Support Program, RCSP. And there were 19 grantees across the country, all different demographics. And we had one of those grants, and I was a project director, and we would come together twice a year as a learning community. I didn't know what a learning community was then, but I learned really quickly. And there were people like Phil Valentine and Bev Haberly and Don Koyas and so Donna Dimitrovic. I was exposed to all these like great thinkers and people who had really good recovery, and we're talking about what would it be like to mobilize and organize communities in recovery. That was the job we were supposed to do. It was a heavy lift, you know, and people kept saying, you will never do this, you will never get people out of the church basements. People have tried, they've failed, and we kept coming together and saying, we think they're wrong, you know, and we started off really small. Sometimes you'd have 7 people in a room talking about policy change and public education, but it grew and grew and grew. And so that was, you know, that was 1998.
And language was a big part of this, new language?
Well, we talked about what coming out would be like, you know, and some people were already out about the recovery. We talked about safe ways that we could be anonymous in our 12-step programs if we belong to that, but
because there's a tradition about anonymity that served as a huge barrier for a lot of...
Well, it serves as a barrier, but it also serves a purpose. You know, it serves a purpose for humility and lots of, you know, spiritual anonymity. All those things I think are very important still. But you don't have to violate a 12-step tradition to come out publicly about your recovery.
But we didn't know that back then.
Right.
Yes.
So,
so this was transformative to learn this new language and ways of being able to get the word out without risk of violating any traditions.
Right. And so a lot of us were in 12-step programs, some of us weren't, but the 12-step people we were involved with in our communities were, for the most part, very much against this whole thing, very distrustful. And it wasn't until years later when Greg Williams did the Anonymous People, and you and I showed, you showed that in Annapolis, and I was on a panel afterwards.
Yes.
That was like, what, 2014? Or like, I know it was freezing cold January night.
It was.
And so that happened all over the country, and people who didn't know about recovery had an aha moment, and people who in 12-step programs even had an aha moment. So it was a real game changer. And you know, showing that movie all around the country, it was also a game changer with young people. And the young people who had been brought up on social media, they didn't have any of the baggage around anonymity or about public disclosure because their lives were an open book on social media. So they came with a whole new perspective and a whole new energy.
And they were forming and organizing at the time.
YPR, Young People in Recovery, the collegiate recovery movement, the high school recovery movement, like all the stuff that was sort of happening just exploded and flourished all over the country. So the Anonymous People, I think, was a huge shift.
No doubt.
It was like, you know, one of those pivotal moments in history. And then, you know, 2 years later, in 2015, Greg also, you know, started Facing Addiction and Unite to Face Addiction, where 15,000 plus people in recovery, family members, allies, people in the addiction field, treatment, all came out on the
It was cold, but it was thrilling.
It was it was one of those events where you know, it's like you just looked at it and sobbed. It was just so, it was like, this is our moment. This is what we've been waiting for. So, you know, I always call that event the overnight event that took 20 years to happen, because that's what it takes. It takes, you know, it takes people working in the trenches in really lonely areas thinking, will this really happen? Will this really happen? Coming together, sort of supporting one another, moving really, really slowly, and then all of a sudden just catapulting. You know, it's waiting for that moment in history. So it was really exciting.
I'd just like to let our viewers know that we're listening to Tom Hill on Recovery Today through PAC 14, and he is on fire this morning, so thrilled to have you here. So let me stop, get back to you, and let you continue your story.
Well, you know, for me, I always say I was at the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time, because so much of my career or being part of this movement was just really happenstance. It was just sort of like You know, in some ways, the way we speak, you know, we've been called to do this work, or it was meant to happen, or you know, all those sort of like spiritual components. But it's stuff that I can't really take credit for. I was just there, you know, and it was so exciting to be there, and it's exciting to be a part of something. But there were also seeds of doubt throughout. It's like, you know, will this really take hold? You know, maybe those people actually are right. You know, maybe we can't organize people in recovery.
There had been some false starts like the Operation Understanding back in 1976, where we had a number of prominent people that stood out on a national basis, and yet when we thought the tide was beginning to turn, we saw some serious pushback.
And even in the early 90s with SOAR, Society for Saving Addiction Recovery, you know, lots of false starts. And I think we have to be really cautious right now that we keep the momentum going, that we keep pushing forward, because there's always going to be forces that want to push us back. There's always going to be people who want to see us fail. Who you know, say, see, we told you you couldn't do it, or you know, you got too big for your britches, those kinds of things. And so I think, you know, we have to move forward with humility and with understanding, but to keep pushing forward all the time. And people get tired, you know, people get tired of the movement that, you know, to sustain a movement takes a lot of background work, a lot of grunt work, you know, a lot of but we have, the good thing is we have an army of soldiers now that we didn't have before.
Speaking of grunt work, I'm mindful as you transitioned from Faces and Voices of Recovery, Altram, and then you were presidential appointment through Barack Obama to SAMHSA, and did you not end up working on the Surgeon General's report?
Right, right. So, you know, I want to talk a little bit about that appointment, because I joined Tom Kader, who is a longtime friend of mine, and it was such a pleasure and honor to serve him, as we were the two presidential appointees serving at SAMHSA. And he got there before I did, and really made a space for me there. And I just want to tell you, John, one thing I really underestimated, and I've underestimated this throughout my journey, is that when people like us in recovery, just, you know, garden variety people with addiction backgrounds who overcome it and have a journey of recovery, you know, we're not really different or more unique than anybody else. But when we, you know, sort of get into certain kinds of positions, like a presidential appointee, that's sort of a big deal, right? And so I knew it was going to be a great thing in terms of being able to be in a position to really make some change happen, to work on the Surgeon General's report and get recovery stuff in there that might not have gotten in there otherwise. But one thing I underestimated was that I'm going to tear up, the community was so moved and touched by Tom and I being there. So when you
say the community,
the recovery community. So, you know, all of our community members, you know, I got letters, I got emails, I got calls saying, yay, you know, one of us is in this position. And you know, it's also Michael Botticelli was the drug czar at that time. So like the three of us, I think it was like the first time that people out in their recovery were in those positions.
Right, high positions.
So we got to educate on that level, but we also got to represent. And like I said, I underestimated how moved everybody was and how proud everybody was. And this is where I tear up, because it's, you know, it's to be chosen to represent is such a complete honor. And also to be able to have hands on levers, to be able to lift obstacles and open doors, to get some of those people in on expert panels and advisory groups, invited to meetings and conferences, was a huge, you know, just delight on my part to be able to get all of my colleagues who otherwise people didn't realize their level of expertise or their lived experience. That's something that we value all the time, because we know that so many people in our community are indeed experts.
Absolutely. I just need to interject that this is one of the things that I love about recovery, people in recovery that can get to a place where they're willing and able to just let their feelings surface, and it is okay. It is okay.
I know it's okay. I just don't like crying in the middle of speaking because then I can't talk. But it's communication nonetheless.
I'm in the process of reading William White's newest publication.
Yeah, I'm reading it too. Yeah.
Recovery Rising, and he's talking about the early days of the addictions field and treatment, and then eventually getting into and focusing on recovery specific issues, and there was a transformation with that, and we see that happening just all across not only our country, but I think internationally as well. And I know that for Maryland, for instance, one of the things that I'm in a position where I can address some of the concerns that we have as new dollars are released through the opioid crisis to address opioid-specific, addiction-specific concerns. They've broken it down into 3 categories of prevention, enforcement, and treatment. And so my question is, where is recovery? They have a small piece, and it's about peer services, which I would invite you to speak about the peer movement. But, my concern is that for one, that recovery is not part of treatment. It's something that, that certainly transcends beyond. It may begin in treatment, but it is an entity of itself. And I think that there is a movement afloat to really, and you are helping with that, so I thank you for that, helping to move that out to its own field.
Well, it's again, it's that complicated and often tiresome part of movement building is that you have to say things again and again and again. You constantly have to show up and say, "What about us? Where's recovery? Where's recovery services?" And I think part of it is we're still in the process of educating even our field about what an extended continuum of care looks like, what recovery-oriented systems of care look like. That it's prevention, it's treatment, and it's recovery services, and support, and which also include indigenous community supports, right? So it's all, I think there's always a tendency to go back to what people know. And I think that, that what we really have to hammer home is what happens when people do go to treatment, what happens when they leave? And that's where we call recovery capital. Like, what are the strengths that they have to build on, or what are the deficits that need to be built up? And what kinds of supports in the community exist or need to exist in order to have good, effective recovery management, right?
And up till now, there has been very little research on this. Lots of research that's been developed on treatment, but in terms of recovery specific, what happens after and what happens in that transitory process?
Well, I'll tell you, John, it's, before I started Face and Voices as a staff in 2010, but I was a founding board member in 2005, and Recovery Research Agenda was always at the top of our list from the very beginning. And so, and we've hammered that advocacy home that we have things that need to be evaluated correctly and researched in order that we can start to build evidence-based practice out of what we call practice-based evidence. So we know what works. We just need the rigorous research facilitation in order to have that effective quantitative and qualitative data.
So that's starting to happen now.
It's starting to happen, and it's happening very slowly, but it's like, with people like John Kelly at Recovery Research Institute, Keith Humphreys, even that chapter, the recovery chapter in the Surgeon General's report, I will tell you, at first they didn't want to include a lot of this stuff because it wasn't evidence-based practice. And Tom Cadera and I said, you have to have this in here, you have to couch it differently, frame it differently, and say these are promising practices moving toward an evidence base. Because if you don't have it in here, it won't count, and we need it to count right now. So a lot of this is sort of strategic thinking, trying to get in wherever you can. To get in wherever you can, and to sort of, but it's like to be an advocate, you really have to be tireless, and you don't get wins really easily. And when you do get wins, you have to make sure that you secure them and sustain them, because what you get can also be taken away.
We're getting short on time right now, Tom, and it's
Oh, we
flown
can talk
by
for
really
hours.
flown by really fast. Quickly, or if you care to, a little bit about peer services and that new workforce.
Well, peer services, I feel again we're on this cusp of it really taking fire, and yet there's also this tendency that it's misunderstood or misdirected by the professional treatment people. So again, maybe we haven't communicated well enough. Maybe we need to really articulate that it's peers is really based on somebody with lived experience and training helping another person in a non-clinical way, in a non-12-step environment, and giving that emotional support, hooking people up to community resources, getting them recovery housing, getting them into education and employment programs, really helping people build up their recovery capital so they can sustain long-term recovery.
Something that we're working on in Maryland that I know that you've heard of is the in regard to the peer workforce is to harness the expertise, experience, pain, value of family members with lived experience, to include those that have lost loved ones from addiction, and to give them more of an active role to be able to help other family members that are struggling with those inactive addictions, those that are in recovery in some degree or another, as well as those that have lost their lives through addiction.
You know, John, since starting the peer service stuff up with the Recovery Community Services program, that happened around 2001 when we were starting that. And the family piece always came in there, and we never quite knew, that we sort of build it in the back door, we build it a sort of sub-program, but didn't really elevate it to the place where we all thought it needed to be. But it was like you focus on one thing, and then you sort of focus on the next thing. But I think really the opioid epidemic and the overdosing of young people and family members with that sense of loss, that profound sense of losing their children, gave us a chance to really harness on an advocacy level what that parent movement would look like in the recovery movement. And I think we're trying to figure out a way to build that in a really authentic way, because it is so powerful. And also, people listen to family members in a different way than they listen to people in recovery. So you want to do both ends, right? But also the fact that family members need support. That they need grief support, and then moving through their own recovery process, and that peer-to-peer, family member to family member is a very powerful component that I'm really happy to see that programs are starting to build that out.
Amen. Now, somewhat related to that, I'm thinking of your, the work that you're doing with the National Council for Behavioral Health and, with addiction and recovery. That organization, to my understanding, initially was almost exclusively focused on mental health. Over the years, and one of the things that I believe that they probably brought you on is to help expand and be inclusive of substance use disorders, addictions-related concerns. And so there's that, we've had that, as you know, in Maryland, we've had that work that we've had to integrate the two systems. There's also this work that's happening on a national front, bringing them together, and in some ways there's a very real and close connection with people that have what we call co-occurring disorders, both addictions issues as well as mental health concerns. So you're helping to bridge the gap there?
Yeah, so it's like bringing together mental health and substance use disorders, integrating that, and then integrating that into primary care. It all makes a lot of sense, but it's all really difficult, a really heavy lift, because we all come with so much baggage, right? We know that so many people in our communities and people we serve have issues in mental illness and in addiction.
Simultaneously.
And they should never have to choose which door they go to get help. I mean, that's the bottom line. But they do. The systems are very different. The National Council for Behavioral Health for many years was mental health oriented, and realized that that in order to be behavioral health, they really needed to pull in addiction. So so that's been a learning curve. And I've worked with the mental health folks on the peer side for many, many years now. So I'm sort of a good bridge. I'm a good bridger. And I understand a lot of the mental health issues, social worker, right? So, so it's been exciting to bring that in. It's also been exciting to bring the recovery piece in. And I can bring that in on both sides just because of what I've been exposed to. So so it brings in a whole new element, a whole new grassroots community element, the family element, adolescence that you know hasn't been a part of the National Council culture, but it's rapidly changing. Not just because of me, because the world's changing. And so to be a part of the world, and it's a very powerful organization in our field or fields, and we're expanding to represent the full spectrum.
Speaking of the full spectrum and adolescence and the, I'm just mindful of a mutual friend that you and I have, Perry, and who got sober in prison as an adolescent. Multi-generational addiction in his family. This evening I'm going to be heading over to D.C. Perry's dad recently passed away, and he just also recently had celebrated 50 years of continuous recovery. Perry is coming up on 40 years. He has siblings in recovery. He has children in recovery. So this is a multi-generational thing, and so it's again, it's wonderful to see this kind of thing happening, and the message that's there of hope.
Well, Perry and I we initially bonded because we're from Prince George's County. Our towns are very close to each other. We're from working class backgrounds and with families with mental illness and addiction and violence and all kinds of stuff. So we had that connection right early on. And it's like, I think a lot of this stuff you scratch the surface in recovery and you go deeper and deeper, and you find out like the traumatic events in your life, certain things that you start piecing together in a way.
Back the layers
exactly,
of the
exactly, and things make more and more sense to you in terms of who you are, how you became addicted, and then just the power that we've had to access to be able to overcome that. So fortunate, all of us, really.
You've been listening to Tom Hill at Recovery Today through PAC 14. Tom, it has been wonderful to have you here on our show today.
It's been delightful.
So thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Can I just say one thing? I just want to say, John, and you know this, but there is a recovery movement at foot, not just in our country, but in the entire world.
Yes.
And recovery is coming out, and recovery is coming into a whole new realm of people not just focusing on the problem, but focusing on a solution. And we bring a whole host of gifts of solution. The recovery community does, and I want us to be acknowledged for it, and I also want those gifts to be used. So we have this wonderful opportunity in front of us right now.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you very much, John. Really a pleasure to be on the show.
And thank you for watching Recovery Today through PAC 14. We are going to put up some information about Tom and the National Council as the credits roll. So again, thanks for watching. Look forward to you joining us next time.